All right. Well, good morning, church.
Morning.
Oh my gosh, it is such a pleasure to be joining you today. Our gospel reading today is from Mark 2. I'll read through this and then we'll get into it. So here we go. Mark 2. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisee said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.'" This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I hope that that's something that is said at the end. I have no idea what you say after the gospel readings, but this is okay, and we're just going to keep going. Oh my gosh. Wow, it is such a pleasure to be here on a morning like this. People at New City Church like to say, "Jesus be the snowplow." You know, like whether you are living in some storms in your own life or you're braving the literal blizzard outside, my prayer is that God can plow through and show us the path underfoot, and that we might be on our way to transformation together. And whether this is your first time at church or your first time in a long time, I hope that this time together can be a moment of transformation for you. So, I recognize some of you, but in case I haven't met you, I'm Tyler Sit like a chair. Like a pew? Okay, yep, we're getting this, we're following. And I'm the pastor of New City Church, which is a church that focuses on environmental justice. Me and my friends started New City Church in my living room, the 7 of us eating lasagna, dreaming about what God wants for the city of Minneapolis. We are living in a neighborhood that's in South Minneapolis, in Phillips, Powderhorn, and Central. Have any of you ever been to? Okay, yeah, I see some love. And so you know that those neighborhoods are very diverse, right? Like equal parts African American, white, Latinx, some immigrants from Mexico, some immigrants from Somalia and Ethiopia, Native Americans, a couple of Asians like me, and we're all kind of living together. And so we thought we should probably start a church where we're all living together. So we started listening and creating diverse community together. And we listened to how God is calling us together, not just to be with each other, but also to be with the earth and with creation, and how God yearns for justice for people and the planet together. Because that is the vision that we hear in Revelation 21 of this new city. It's a new city where all tribes are welcomed in, where there's no more violence, and where the whole earth is renewed. And in that living room, eating lasagna, the 7 of us looking at each other, we said, if the city of Minneapolis doesn't look like the new city of God, then we still have work to do. So we planted this new city church, and it has a lot of different diverse people in it because we believe that heaven is going to be pretty diverse. And if we're not busy making heaven on earth, then we're busy with the wrong stuff. So here we are, and it's really, really a pleasure to be joining you across this beautiful Methodist connection. You know, I would not be my father's son if I didn't also wish you a happy Chinese New Year, Gong Hei Fa Choi. You know, on the Chinese side of my family, around this time, we'd be eating those like crispy dumplings, you know, and passing around those bright red envelopes with lucky money in it, and maybe even seeing that giant dragon puppet. You know what I'm talking about? And I've never been there in person, but it's around this time of year that there is a festival in China, and it'll happen on Tuesday this week. But it's a festival of lanterns. It's a lantern festival, and so it's when people construct those delicate rice paper lanterns, you know, and then light a candle on the inside, and then people release the light into the sky, and it drifts upward, the flames flickering against the darkest winter night. And it's so beautiful, and one day I believe that I'll be able to see that in person. But even without that lantern festival, I love participating in these traditions from my family, because these traditions are rituals of remembering. It's a time when I pause with my family to remember who I am and who we are. And I bet you have your own family traditions, right? Where maybe some of you eat special foods or sing certain songs, or I met this woman last week who every year she writes everything that she didn't like about the year onto toilet paper, and then she goes outside and burns it. I'm like, okay, yeah. Whatever butters your bagel. So the point is that these rituals help us remember who we are. And certainly in the Jewish tradition, one of the most important rituals of remembrance is Shabbat, or we translate that as Sabbath. This is an incredibly important ritual that you have to understand in order to grasp what's going on in our reading today with Jesus. So, it's very important for the Jewish people, this ritual of Sabbath. Ever since Moses was lugging those giant stone tablets down the mountain with the 10 Commandments, there recognized the Sabbath was numero cuatro. You know, it made the top 10 of recognizing the Sabbath, right up there with not murdering people. So if you think about how much you don't want to murder someone, that's how much yearning that the Jewish people had for recognizing the Sabbath. And whenever you have a rule that is that important, you naturally start to ask a lot of questions because you want to get it right? And so there are just books and books and books of Jewish scholarship about how to get the Sabbath right, because they really believed that God thought it was that important and that it was worth looking into. Rest wasn't just this thing that they did on default on a Friday night when they were feeling completely exhausted. It took planning and intention. And so we have all of this scholarship that reads out what it means to rest on the day of rest. And, if you look into the scholarship, some of the traditional rules for Shabbat make a lot of sense for even people in modern times like us. Rules about not participating in commerce, you're not buying, you're not selling. There's a Sabbath rule about not harvesting or plucking anything, which is where Jesus and his friends got into a little bit of trouble, in the wheat field. But there are also regulations that we might find surprising in modern times, like not igniting fires, which is why traditionally in the Jewish tradition, many people won't turn on a light switch on Sabbath, because that's completing a circuit and that's starting a fire, right? Or not disentangling fibers. There are some rules that maybe aren't as clear to us, but the rules on Shabbat are not just about what you can't do, it's about what you can do. And so traditionally, we're also encouraged to, invite people to eat sumptuous foods together, and to bless your children, and to sleep, and to lie on your back and put your hands on your belly. Wasn't that a perfect children's sermon, by the way? Katie, you gotta love Jesus if you're willing to lie down in front of all of you folks to teach these kids about. But I mean, it's exactly right. Like that's the kind of the day to be doing all of those things. And of course, the Sabbath is the day to remember who you are and what God has done for our people, to remember a history of slavery, and to remember God's liberation into a new land, to remember that we belong together. And then keep in mind that when people say rest, it's not rest like we think of today. Nowadays, we kind of think of rest as something that you kind of have to earn, right? Like you earn vacation time, or you only deserve to take a break after you really get out there and work and hustle. But on Shabbat, in the Jewish tradition, everyone rests. You know, in my undergrad at Boston University, I took a class with Elie Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust, and then he wrote about it, won a Pulitzer Prize, won the Nobel Peace Prize, I should say. And he survived the Holocaust, and he was saying, you know, he was in this horror land where every one of his people were being exterminated, and he talked about how valuable it was to smuggle in some Shabbat candles and to light those flames against the dark winter sky of a concentration camp, where everything was tears and barbed wire and mud. There was Sabbath, like a miniature sunrise. Abraham Heschel calls Sabbath a cathedral in time, because no matter where a Jewish person is and no matter how rough things get, the Sabbath is their cathedral for everyone. You know, I became pretty obsessed with this idea of Sabbath during seminary because I was, I don't know how to say this nicely, overworked out of my mind. I was exhausted, and I know none of you can relate, so you're really going to have to practice empathy here. But I was really, really tired, and I was at this breaking point, you know, constantly studying. And I was like, you know, at that spot where you get so tired that you're like, I know that this isn't how life is supposed to be. I know this isn't it. I might not know what it is I'm going to or what a balanced life looks like, but I know that this ain't it, and I need to work to change this. And so I studied Sabbath. I poured myself into this tradition of these texts because I believe that it offered a way of a new life that I wasn't living into now. And so I studied Sabbath not as an academic interest, but as a sacred oxygen mask, hoping to find new life. And I kept trying on these different things, and there were really three rhythms that needed to be in place for me to really get into Sabbath. Around a New City Church, this is around when people would be pulling out papers to take notes. Okay, that's fine. You do you. So the first is, in Sabbath, I really needed a rhythm of adoration. It's not just gratitude. It's like soul gratitude, where your whole body feels thankful. Have you ever felt so alive because of how amazing the world is? So these rhythms of adoration might include prayer or worshiping or praying or singing, being in nature. It's a time when I can finally stop the narrative that says that I have to be in control of everything, or that I can't make mistakes, or that this whole thing depends on me, because I can look at the grandeur of God and see that God's hands can hold much more than mine. And on Sabbath, I like to have a rhythm of adoration and also a rhythm of delight, which is very aligned with that Old Testament practice. It's the time when I can eat food that I enjoy and engage art and have meaningful conversations. It's when I remember that life is not just about production, it's about finding deep satisfaction in the world that God made. It's like Mary Oliver says, it's discovering that the world offers itself to your imagination. And lastly, my third rhythm of Sabbath is one of subversion. Let's not forget that Moses lugged those giant stone tablets down the mountain, not as some comfortable middle-class person, but that rather he was a former slave. These are, I should say, it comes from a nation of people who were formerly enslaved, leading people into freedom. He was with a band of radical people who decided collectively that they were not going to live in a Pharaoh world because Pharaoh's world meant death to God's children. And so they ran across this dried seabed and charged into wilderness, not because they knew what freedom looked like, but that they knew God and that God knew what freedom looked like, and their job was to follow God. And so on Sabbath, it's my job to be thinking about how I am contributing to the oppression of others, whether it is willing or unwilling, conscious or subconscious. It's not fair for me to rest while living in a way that forces other people to do more work. Something we talk a lot about at New City. And I was excited to hear that you all are doing a lot of programming around race conversations, and you've already talked a lot about this. But something that we talk about at New City is that getting rid of racism is not just about thinking it away. It is not enough to think that racism is bad. There is muscle memory and inherited reflexes and stuff in our body that carries racism in our tissues, in our neural pathways, in our genes. And you can tell that that is true because I bet that there are many bodies right now that are feeling reactions to me bringing this up. And it's not because of your thoughts, it's because of your body deciding whether or not this is safe or not. And so we have these kind of instincts, and we need to move away from thinking that racism is just these, in the civil rights era, there was this large campaign to show that racism was about particular acts of conscious maliciousness. We hear about hate crimes all the time that are those horrendous acts of conscious maliciousness. A couple weeks ago, a black man in Chicago was cornered by a couple of white men, and they poured bleach all over him and hung a artificial noose around his neck, not to threaten, not to physically harm him, but to intimidate him and to scare him. And that's kind of those particular acts of conscious maliciousness. That certainly is one particularly violent expression of racism. But then there's also racism in this kind of like pervasive subconscious kind of way. It's like the rest of the iceberg that's below the surface of the water. It's kind of just those subtle ways that people cut in line at the bus stop, or the ways that, I had an intern. New City has a ton of interns all the time, and it's I had an intern who was white, and we were walking down the street, and then the intern was like, "Oh, I want to cross the street," and there was an African American person walking down the street on the side of the street that we started at, and then the intern said, "I want to cross the street," and I paused and said, "Why is that? Why do you want to cross the street? What's going on right now?" And the intern authentically didn't know why. It wasn't like a conscious decision like, "Oh, I don't want to be around black people," because that intern believes that racism is bad. However, there are still muscle memories and instincts that we need to work through in our bodies, not just in a thought way, but in an embodied way, because this is how we perpetuate narratives of fear and harm. So we do workshops on that on Sabbath at New City Church. We call it Undoing White-Bodied Supremacy. And we're saying we know that you think that racism is bad, and we're so grateful for that. So let's just push and see this all the way through. Let's really practice what we preach and walk the talk. And we're doing all of this work, and it's just blowing up at New City. We got a grant from the city of Minneapolis to be able to continue this. There are more and more people filing in saying, I really want to take this seriously because we are in 2019, and there are still heinous acts of violence happening against Black and brown people, and that needs to change, and I want to be part of the solution. And so we're doing these slow workshops. And it just reminds me that on Sabbath, it's not just about living a comfy life. It's about living into God's truth and living into how God sees the world. And heaven is a diverse place. And it is our job to start living into that heaven, to start getting busy making heaven on earth. So that was it. That was the rhythm of adoration, the rhythm of delight, and the rhythm of subversion. So I did all this research, started doing a lot of my own personal research and experimenting with things. And, eventually, after years and years of this, I felt like I kind of got this down. I know what I'm doing. I get Sabbath. I know how to rest. And then I read the Gospel of Mark, and it messes up everything because as the Bible often does, right? Because there Jesus and his disciples were walking through these grain fields, their hands passing over these pods of grass, and they're really hungry, and Jesus allows them to break the Sabbath regulation of harvesting grain. And the message is clear that if you don't locate your hunger for God, then Sabbath will always be a list instead of a devotional practice. And what God needs us to do at least once a week is to have a devotional practice where we are hungry for God, and then we find satisfaction and delight from that hunger, relief from that hunger in the Sabbath practice. This is why I see people like a lot of times I'll see people going off to a vacation that's like a week or two long in the Caribbean, and then they'll come back, and after 2 days of work, they are just as exhausted as they were before they left for vacation. And the reason why is because they're not getting at the deeper underlying things that are exhausting people. They're not getting at those deeper questions or narratives that are running themselves ragged. I'll give some examples. One of the things that a lot of people at New City Church struggle with is the narrative of, I'm not enough. The belief that they're not enough, that they don't ultimately deserve rest, or that they're worthy of God's love. And if that's the narrative that's running in your head, if that's the tape that's playing, that will sap every ounce of energy that you have, no matter how many pillows and pot roasts you throw into that hole. It is like a vacuum for your energy and your life with God. Or what about this? The narrative of, I can't ask for help because I'm scared of what I will find. I hear this a lot from folks who are resisting seeking therapy or asking for help. It's like they have this Pandora's box inside their chest, and they don't know if they'll ever recover if they open what is inside. And honestly, if I'm being totally honest with you here, I hear this mostly from men who know that there's some type of pain that's deep in their heart, and it's not going away. But they're also afraid to address it because if you open up that box, who knows what else will come out? And so they become workaholics instead, right? Or what about this narrative of other people need rest, but I don't need rest. Other people should take a break, but I don't need to rest or practice self-care. And honestly, I meet a lot of older folks who were able to do some things, and then as they've continued to age, their body has changed and has different needs, and they kind of have this narrative of like, well, I just have to power through it, I just have to muscle through it, and all at the same time, they're telling their grandkids, you should take a break, it seems like you're doing a lot of extra school activities, you're working too hard, but they are working themselves to the bone. And none of you can relate to this, I'm sure. I'm sure this is just the other folks in our community. And so, the more I live as a pastor, and the more I have people open up to me about what's really going on the inside, the more I realize that we need something beyond. As a Christian, I believe that we need something beyond the Jewish understanding of Shabbat. We need a Christian understanding from Sabbath, because we don't need just a ritual of remembrance. We need a ritual of a resurrection. We need a ritual of returning to the dead places of our lives and declaring that the power that raised Christ from the grave is alive in us as well. And that means that we can start living into a new life. And when we start living into that new life, we start to create a resurrection world. And through awe and delight and liberation, we are able to see that God's vision for justice and peace is not just for our fumbling hands to create. No, the creator of the universe breathed liberation into the beginning, the Alpha, and the end, the Omega. God has prepared a way for us. Jesus is being a snowplow, making a way, and Sabbath is the time for us to live into that resurrection. It is our job to pray so hard that our hope lights like a brave fire against the dark winter night and rises up to God, a people of hope living and worshiping the Lord of the Sabbath. Amen.